I now have the pleasure of being able to facilitate this town hall session. So, just as we did in our last session, please be sure to add your comments in the comment box so that your questions can appear here on the screen. But to get us started, Haley, I would love to hear a little from you about your perspective. I know that DEI has changed so much in the legal field in the last few years, and I would love to hear about some of those changes from your perspective. Like, what have you seen? What do you hope to see continue to grow in that space?
I think, at least for me, what I've seen is this topic is actually relevant for the first time to a lot of people. And when I would talk about neurodiversity in law school, people kind of laughed, to be quite honest, as they were surprised that I thought this was important. And change happens very quickly and very slow. And even when I wanted to go through things like I realized how inaccessible the process was, and diversity did not include people with disabilities. And I thought that was really fascinating. And it was almost assumed that people with disabilities didn't go to law school or something. And something else that makes me really excited about the space changing is we are realizing, I think, especially with the pandemic that happened, about how more accommodations than we thought were reasonable. And we, in fact, were really just highlighting our own biases more than we would have expected. So I think what my future is really realizing that our diversity is one of our greatest strengths. And that does include things that we don't often visualize. Is we think DEI is always things that we can easily pinpoint, like race or gender, or even perhaps LGBTQ plus status, but it's also things that are less apparent, like disability or veterans or religious diversity, that there's so many different facets of what it really means to be a diverse profession. And it really does mean we also have to give in more to the sense of belonging. And I think also with those increased focuses on mental health in our profession, that's a huge part of this as well.
Yes. And you talked about some different areas of diversity, and I would love to talk to you a little more about, as someone who sits kind of in this intersectionality in terms of diversity, how have you been able to, you know, fight or be able to value all the parts of yourself that makes you diverse in the legal field, and how have you found support for different parts of that intersectionality, for those different intersectionalities that you sit in?
Oh my gosh. I think one of the most interesting things for me is getting to be around neurodivergent women, and especially who are attorneys, because a lot of the disparities, if you break it down by race and gender, are really fascinating, especially autism and ADHD, which are two things I know probably the best. And a lot of women in particular do not get identified until later in life. They either get identified as teenagers or as adults. And primarily that reflects the bias of parts of the medical system and how the DSM is written, as well as what clinicians and teachers are looking for. But whenever I meet women, there's this kind of understanding. And what happens is, because of how perhaps people are socialized or the different expectations, that they're less likely to disclose, or there's this idea that you have to be perfect in work-life balance. And what about now the fact that this also is something that impacts my kids? Do I bring that up with my kids? Do I bring it up with me? So for me, I feel like what's happened at these different intersections is I feel like I found a kinship that I didn't think would really exist. And at
Mm,
the same time, it's a space that predominantly has been dominated by men, because essentially, based on even when I was a kid, the folks who would get identified in school were always little white boys, to put it bluntly, because that was who might be disruptive in school or who may not have good grades. Like, I'm very aware that I have the privilege of having been identified as a kid because I was a late speaker. I think if I started talking when other kids were talking, I might not have gotten picked up because I did well in school. I was
mm.
quiet. I was, well, a teacher's pet type kid. So the more that I think about it, the more I think you can't talk about neurodiversity without talking about the intersections. And same with these motivations for trying to pass as neurotypical or having to mask certain traits and suppress them. Because I think, especially for women, you're thinking about harassment. You might be thinking about different forms of bullying. I know that autistic and neurodivergent people of color often talk about things like police and also culture, and that how we talk about disability is very interesting to me. So I personally love that it is an intersectional topic, and it's hard to ignore because of that.
You started to touch on something in your last comment that there's a question about in the chat, and you kind of talked about being able to be diagnosed when you were younger. What steps can a neurodivergent high school student take to explore the possibility of a legal career?
Oh my gosh, this is a great question because I wish that I had explored legal careers when I was in high school. But there do need to be more pipelines and more resources for neurodivergent students who want to enter this profession. I think one of the biggest roadblocks that we do have that I didn't realize was such a big roadblock happens to be in the bar admissions process, where folks are often expected to disclose about their mental health or different forms of adversity on a law school application. But there's one of the things that I really like that exists as a resource. It's mostly for college students right now, but it is from the Quello Center at Loyola Law School, and it is their Center for Disability Law Policy and Innovation. And they have a fellowship program that teaches students with disabilities all about disability rights history and connects them with resources. The ABA Commission on Disability Rights also has some resources. There's all sorts of really cool things out there.
So we are coming through a pandemic, but still doing a lot of virtual work. And one of the questions here in the Zoom says, do you think Zoom and other virtual platforms have made it easier or more difficult for neurodiverse individuals to interact with others?
I would say this is a very individual question, because if you have met one person who is neurodivergent, my experience is not reflective of everybody, and I do not claim to be the spokesperson, nor do I want to be. But for me, Zoom has made my life infinitely more accessible. That a lot of accommodations that I might not have been able to get, I can easily fix in my own life. I love that I can make my environment as sensory friendly as I want. I love that I don't always have to be present, in the sense that I can leave my camera off because I get distracted. I love having closed captions, recordings, and other note-taking assistants because I struggle a lot with taking notes at meetings. I just do. And I think people also have an easier time circulating things like agendas. I do, however, find it a lot harder to socialize. I do appreciate being around colleagues, of course, and making friends. So I do think socially it's more difficult, but professionally it's a heck of a lot easier.
There's a question about clients, and it says, what are the best strategies to hold space for clients who are neurodiverse?
This is a fantastic question, and I think it's important to meet your clients where they're at. So again, each person's needs are unique. That you might have a client who can't sit still for more than 20 minutes. Maybe if you have to do a deposition with them, that you do, along with opposing counsel, build in those breaks as an accommodation for them. Or if they need to fidget, that you have different fidgets and stuff for them, or that they might be able to bring that and not have to worry about how they're perceived. I always like to think of, what does this person need? And of course, you have your usual concerns about if that's someone with diminished capacity, or if there's an attorney-client privilege thing because they might have someone else with them. And I think there's also this question of competence that comes up a lot, and especially with folks who may have an intellectual disability or a non-speaker, and understanding that just because someone may not appear to understand doesn't mean that they don't. I also love that people do communicate in very different and unique ways. So I try to find ways to hold space for that. And also what I like to do whenever I do work with neurodivergent people, especially those who may not have the same level of understanding that I do, is plain language. And plain language means that we are not essentially, quote unquote, dumbing it down, which is a whole ableist question in of itself in that language, but that's always what people assume that it means. It means that we're breaking down what we say without jargon in a way that anybody can understand. So there was a really great example that I've gotten to use about confidentiality, that we're not trying to shy away from adult topics. We're just using these topics and breaking them down into an approachable way. So it might be like, you can tell me secrets, but I can't tell them to other people unless you say that's okay. And someone with an intellectual disability who might have some kind of proceeding, or maybe your client, like, they're going to understand that. And of course, just what I always like to do no matter what is ask how you can be supportive, because each person does have unique needs and strengths and weaknesses. So sometimes if someone knows that they need something, if you give them that space with, how do I be supportive? Then they know that they can ask a question, or that if they need a break, that you might be able to provide that. And I think that's a great way to also know the individual, because everybody does have such a unique experience.
Mm.
Now, what's helpful for me might not be helpful for you.
Exactly. And I think that's something, like you said in the beginning of your answer, that that question was a very individualistic question, but meet your clients where they are is one of the most important takeaways, I think. Earlier, you talked about how it starts from the top down and being able to implement support for neurodiverse in firms or in organizations. But what advice do you have for younger attorneys who are trying to bring awareness of neurodiversity into their firms so that it can be embraced?
Oh my gosh. So for younger attorneys, I don't know if we're making the assumption that you are an ally, an advocate, or you are neurodivergent yourself. Because I think depending on where you're coming from depends on how you might want to bring this into your firm. If you are neurodivergent yourself, I think you need to also consider disclosure, how you're doing it, if you've done it before, because disclosure is one of those really strange things that is very individualized and also situational. So I've been in situations where I do not feel safe disclosing, because I feel like I'm definitely going to be treated differently, or my colleagues are going to assume I'm receiving special treatment. Like, there's so much that you might not want to deal with, that maybe that's not the way that you want to go. And disclosure ideally should be on your terms. If you need an accommodation and that's how you want to get that ball rolling, then have that conversation with perhaps your managing partner or HR. If you want to keep growing the issue and you do not want to be the spokesperson, if you work at a bigger firm, definitely talk to whoever is in DEI or HR. Maybe that there's something they might be wanting to do to help change the hiring process to be more inclusive. Maybe they want to bring in diverse speakers. There's so many different ways to make sure that's part of the conversation. And I'm really grateful that there's all sorts of CLEs. Again, this conversation's been evolving so much more. And as far as younger attorneys go, something that's really powerful to me is that they've been the real change makers in the disability space for attorneys. Is law students were the ones, since I graduated law school 4 years ago, who brought the Disabled Law Students Association nationwide, and chapters are popping up at law schools all across the country. That would have been unheard of or seen as impossible when I was in law school. So knowing how much change really does happen is so powerful, and realizing that it does. And honestly, talk to your colleagues. If you work at a big firm as well, you can also consider maybe starting an advocates and allies type affinity group. So I know firms that have a disability affinity group, and there's a couple really great examples. So places I know, like Reed Smith has a really established one. I know Holland and Knight has a disability group. And when you see firms with disability groups, they usually do have space for everyone. So what's cool about disability groups and neurodiversity groups in particular, if this is something that you want to explore at a larger firm, or if your firm has affinity groups, is they're not just always neurodivergent or disabled people, but also siblings and parents and people who just want to know more and help. So that might also be a really safe way to start your advocacy, because if you are or are not neurodivergent or disabled, you will still have a place in that conversation that feels a little bit broader of a coalition, and also that might feel safer. So a little bit of some stuff to play with.
That actually leads, this isn't a question from the chat, but it's a question that I would love to ask you is, could you discuss some resources that the legal community could offer neurodiverse clients and colleagues? And I guess, as you just said, it's not always going to be a client or colleague. It may be also beneficial to a family member as well.
Yes, and I do wish there was honestly more for us on representing neurodivergent people. There's a really great book by Elizabeth Kelly about representing clients on the autism spectrum, which I found extremely helpful to get to read and research. And there's things I had no idea were possible to implement or understand. Like, she talks a lot about criminal defense, and I remember learning that even your client, if they are in prison, that they can get accommodations in prison, which is something I might have never thought about because I was never a criminal defense attorney. So I think that's part of that. Some other resources I really like are things like, I do like a lot of the work that the ACLU does on disability. I do like a lot of things that disability rights advocates and DREDF are doing. Each state also has a protection and advocacy organization. So check out your organization as well to see what they're up to. I also am shameless in the fact that I've done stuff. I know that the ABA Commission on Disability Rights has a few things. If you're looking for things on specific conditions, something that I also recommend as a huge resource for you, especially for workplace accommodations and the like, because this might be the most impactful for us, is askjan.org. And that's the Job Accommodation Network. It is funded by the Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy. And they also have a lot of really great resources as well. So it gives you ideas about accommodations, some information on different conditions, and also what might be helpful for people with each of these things in a professional setting.
And I do have one more question. And feel free, if you have other questions, please put them in the chat. Respecting neurodiversity, means challenging assumptions about intelligence and how it's measured. So how does showing this respect and valuing neurodiversity add to overall diversity efforts?
Oh my gosh. I think that it's something we've just been very bad about ignoring. And when you talk about this idea of intelligence, I think that we have to redefine almost what we are measuring and what we think intelligence is. So I think a lot about your basic IQ test or standardized tests for that measure. And standardized tests are gatekeeping devices at the end of the day. I'm sorry, I have to say it. And how I feel about that is complicated, and that these things are designed to exclude. So how do we design, and especially with DEI, from the perspective of how do we include? How do we include people who may feel that they're unable to be themselves, or they're not safe as themselves, or that they're not going to be discriminated or retaliated against because of our preconceived notions? And a lot of this, honestly, at least for me, still has an education component. And I think about that a lot because I even saw in the chat earlier that folks were saying, I've never heard of this topic, or this is new to me. And I know almost every time I get to chat with lawyers, they go, oh my gosh, I have someone in my office, or that someone is me, who has ADHD or this, or I've never mentioned it my entire career. And that was the first time I didn't feel alone in that. So it does show that we have this huge kind of knowledge gap. And I think starting with that knowledge gap is the first thing we need to do.
And I think also for listeners, as you said, there have been times where people have come to you and said this is their first time ever saying that. Do you have any advice for anyone who is neurodiverse to seek that help within their firm, or, give them any advice to make them feel more comfortable about making that known and making sure they have the right resources to be successful?
First off, you are not alone. I think it is very easy to get caught up in that you are the only person who feels this way or has this experience. You are not. You are probably just the only one who is very much willing to say something, because that happens quite a bit. And that's always how I felt, is I'm the only one talking about it, but it doesn't mean I'm the only one who is. And other resources, if you are someone who does want help with your mental health, or you are questioning if you're neurodivergent and you want an evaluation, I would also see what your firm's benefits are through possibly a psychologist, or if you have an EAP plan, like an employee assistance plan, because then you can get all sorts of other stuff for support. As for speaking with your managers and stuff, again, disclosure is a super individualized process, and you're going to be weighing like your pros and cons. Who do you want to know? Do you feel that you're being perceived as receiving special treatment, which is always like my least favorite thing in the world. So I personally would just weigh that out. And if you don't want people to know, but you think you need help, my biggest advice to you is try doing a soft disclosure. And the soft disclosure is kind of a fill in the blanks exercise. And you can do this with someone who manages you or you work with. And fill in the blanks of something like, it would be really helpful if ... or I work best when ... So I am a very disorganized person. And I also don't know half the time what the most important thing I have to work on is. So if I don't know what the most important thing I have to work on is because I have autism-related executive functioning challenges, which I do, that my organization and prioritization and like my brain's thermostat's a little bit off, that instead of saying all that to my supervisor, because that's kind of intimidating, especially if you don't know, I might just say something like, I work best when you give me clear instructions. And that is usually enough to say, or it's really helpful if you provide me with deadlines. That doesn't tell you what's going on in my brain. It doesn't tell you why I need that, but it's enough of a quick advocacy hit that you are probably going to feel infinitely more comfortable helping me, and I don't have to tell you why. It really opens that conversation in a way that feels safe. So I highly recommend doing that. Even if you don't know why you need something like that, or you don't realize it can be helpful, then that can work too, even if you're neurotypical. And the more I think about it, the more I'm convinced nobody's truly neurotypical, and it's just a bunch of social rules that most of us struggle with to some extent. So that's a whole other little aside that's been bouncing around my brain for quite some time. But definitely figure out how to ask for what you need in a way that feels comfortable to you. If you do the soft disclosure, no, you're probably not going to get the same level of protection, if any, with the ADA, since the ADA does require disclosure to protect you. But if you know that you just need something now and you don't feel ready, or you don't have an official diagnosis because of access issues. So like we were mentioning earlier when we talked about how multiply marginalized people don't get access to a diagnosis, for instance, that if that's you, that you're someone who is a woman, you're queer, you're gender nonconforming, you are someone who just doesn't have the money for a psych evaluation or something like that, then try doing a soft disclosure until you get that sorted out. Because then you might be able to get the help that you need without having to say something false, or because you don't want to talk about going through a process that can be kind of arduous in the first place.
Thank you for that advice there. I see some good comments thanking you specifically for your advice during that question. And I think it would be really great to, as we have time for one more question, we talked about universal design in this presentation, and I even learned something new about it. But do you have any specific advice about how we as a profession can implement more universal design, or some top 3 things you think would be important when thinking about universal design for the legal field, serving clients and each other?
This is my biggest thing that I think is probably the easiest to implement, but I believe that everything, every firm, every networking event ever should have a quiet/sensory space, one or another, or both, depending on how much room you have. Is that if you are someone who is easily overwhelmed, you should have somewhere to escape to that you know is going to be quiet. Maybe there is something that, like, if you want to fidget with stuff, like I often do, I'm at a conference right now in person and they gave out these cool little bracelets. I will fidget with them all day long. And knowing that if I want to go escape because I've had too much, I can go take those or whatever other toys or something I have and go kind of hang out. Or think about, like, this stuff exists in airports. It should exist in courts. But I don't know if it will, but there's sensory rooms in most major airports, which I think is like the coolest thing ever. Except my problem is that they're marketed towards children when there are also adults who would benefit from them. But I do think having that quiet space is helpful. If you work in a small firm, your quiet space can essentially be wherever you all gather for lunch or meals during non-meal times. That is always my quick fix. Or have like a nice like lamp in there, something kind of calming if you can. I like that because it also would give my clients possibly somewhere to hang out if it's too much for them. It gives me something if it's too much for me. I would always have different stuff on my desk that if you felt overwhelmed, you can grab like a stress ball. Like there's so many little things like that even if you don't think you need it, someone else might. And it also just makes them feel safer at the same time. And also just think about it like this. And another lawyer said this to me when I was interviewing and writing my book, is people come to lawyers because they're scared. And it's a good scared or a bad scared. Maybe it's a good scared in that they're starting a business or they're finally going to get an adoption figured out. Or it's a bad scared, like they're charged with a crime or they're bankrupt or they're getting divorced, which can be a good scared or a bad scared. And it's up to us to make them feel less scared. So that's something I think is really huge for universal design. And I also feel that's probably just a start, especially because I think about everything in our profession, not just our offices and our physical spaces, but I also think about how we interact with each other and networking. And networking events, I think, are the easiest thing to kind of clean up in a way to be more accessible for people. So whether it's the space we have that if you do need quiet, that you're not just running off to the bathroom. Also, I think our profession's relationship with alcohol is one of those things we need to reimagine just a little bit too to be more accessible for everybody. Is there's a lot of neurodivergent people who do not drink or have addiction related issues. So if you have non-alcoholic beverages at your event or do not ask a billion questions about why someone isn't drinking, I think that's a great thing to do. So then everybody feels included. I just want everyone to feel welcomed, and I feel like that's what universal design really ends up being all about, is that you are making sure that your environment does include everyone. And of course, you have your basic stuff like elevators and stairs and but I think I'm just thinking more abstract right now, just a little bit.
Okay. Thank you, Haley, so much for all of your invaluable insight today. There was so many people who were so grateful for everything that you said that added value to this conference and great advice for them. So we definitely want to thank you for your valuable insights and your time with us today.